All right, great. Well, there are still people coming in, but in the interest of keeping on schedule, we're gonna start. So, welcome to the American Auditory Society's Disparities in Hearing Healthcare seminar. We are really inspired by the large response that we received to this seminar, and we're grateful to you for joining us. Please do mute your microphones and use the chat for questions. So the mission of AAS is to focus on the translation of scientific discovery in hearing imbalance into clinical practice. To pursue this mission, the Society holds an annual meeting, publishes the journal Ear and Hearing, and is involved in various other scientific communications like this one. As such, AAS is deliberately and diligently an apolitical body. However, the murder of George Floyd, the shooting of Jacob Blake, and the other injustices that have led to over 90 days of protest have touched us deeply as human beings and exposed the continuation of systemic inequities and marginalization of Black Americans, along with other minority groups. Each of us have to react to these events in our own way. However, we recognize that healthcare, research, engineering, and industry do not operate and evolve in a societal vacuum. We are committed more than ever to effect positive change in these, our domains of interest and operation. The AAS has been and is keenly focused on increasing the diversity of our disciplinary pipelines, creating equity and opportunities for physicians, and removing implicit and explicit bias in the evaluation of manuscripts and grants. We take the current resurfacing of the deep fractures in our society as an opportunity to redouble our efforts for equity and social justice. One of the most important questions that we're asking is how we can make change in the parts of our lives that are touched by systemic racism and inequity. All of us are in some way involved in hearing healthcare, and so our goal in organizing this seminar was to ask some of the experts in addressing disparities in hearing healthcare to help us find our way forward. I am very pleased to have the honor of introducing them. Our time is short, so please enter your questions into the chat, and Sumit will select a few to read after each talk. Our first presenter is Carrie Nieman, MD, MPH. Dr. Nieman is an assistant professor of otolaryngology, head and neck surgery at Johns Hopkins University. Her clinical practice is dedicated to the medical and surgical management of hearing loss and eustachian tube disorders. Dr. Nieman's research is directed at understanding and addressing hearing health disparities among older adults, particularly among vulnerable populations. Her work focuses on the development and implementation of innovative, community-delivered approaches to affordable, accessible hearing care. Dr. Nieman's talk is entitled, Inequities in Hearing Health, How Do We Care for Our Older Adults? Thanks, Carrie, for being here today, and take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Let me just make sure sharing my slides. Perfect. Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Eric. As Eric mentioned, I'm an otologist at Johns Hopkins and a core faculty member at the Cochlear Center for Hearing and Public Health at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. So I do want to first recognize that we'll be discussing hearing healthcare disparities. And while I think it is easier to have discussions about differences in care from an academic perspective, we need to at least name and recognize the importance of the drivers that really are behind these differences in care, and that go hand in hand with these differences. Things like racism, institutionalized and systemic racism, as well as personally mediated racism. And so I will not be going into depth into these topics, but I want to at least recognize that I by no means am meaning to, downplay the importance of these drivers and the need for us to be identifying these and, really more important, taking action upon these. So with that, we'll start with our exploration of answering the question of how do we care for our older adults. I have no industry-related financial disclosures. And to start, we will get on the same page of basic terms of what we mean when we're thinking and talking about inequities in hearing healthcare. Then we'll talk about where we are, and then why does it matter, at least a little bit on that. I will say, we'll be talking today from a public health approach. And really for this section of it, I'll be talking about age-related hearing loss. So terminology matters, and when I'm using the term inequities in here, and just like Eric in his introduction, when he's using the term inequities, we mean something in particular. And so what do we mean by that? And so we'll start with a couple just basic terms that a lot of us hear a lot. And I think particularly in these past few months or so, I think many of us have been introduced to what is equality, what is equity, what is justice. And again, just to make sure we're on the same page, there are many ways to depict these concepts. This is one that I'm sure many of you have seen as well. So in terms of equality, when we think about equality, we often think about things in terms of sameness. Do people get the same tools, the same resources? Are people being treated equally? But we know that necessarily is not enough given other, things like structural barriers and whatnot. And so what we think then is, okay, well, equality means that in terms of everybody's getting the same exact thing. But what about equity? So equity, when we think about equity, we recognize that these differences exist, and we say, some individuals, some groups may need different tools, different resources in order to have access to the same opportunities. And so we sometimes think about equity as a process in order to reach equality in some ways. Justice then is rethinking things in terms of why does that fence need to be there? Why does that fence need to look that particular way? And to address those structural barriers that may be in place, so that maybe we don't need to be giving different tools, different resources to everybody, but we rethink the system. So again, there are many nuances and many ways in which people define these terms, but at least a start in terms of how we can at least kind of agree upon. So then we think about, well, inequality versus disparity versus inequity. And so sometimes these words are used interchangeably. But again, if we're thinking from a public health perspective, there is meaning, and we use these terms in a particular way. So when we think within public health, we think really that there's a little bit of a line of difference between inequality and disparity versus inequity. And so inequality and disparity are often roughly used in the same ways, in that we are talking about differences in care and outcomes between groups. And internationally, we often use inequality a little bit more because inequality implies that these differences are due to differences in socioeconomic position. Whereas more commonly within the US, we talk about things in terms of disparities, because disparity implies that these differences are based on race ethnicity. So then how do we differentiate that from inequity? So in equity, again, thinking about differences in care, differences in outcomes, but it has generally a value judgment attached to it about the underlying causation of what's going on. So generally, we think about inequality and disparity describing differences in care. Somewhat can be used interchangeably depending on the context. But that there's really no mention or no implication that we understand exactly why or know why the drivers or the mechanisms behind those differences in care. Versus when we use the term inequity, we are implying some judgment in terms of that these are avoidable differences that we were specifically calling out. And that again, that there's this ethical or moral judgment about the underlying causation related to underlying injustices. And we often measure disparities or inequalities as an indicator of equity. So to understand disparities, we know that there are more drivers to health than just kind of who you are in terms of the genetics, as well as the clinical care that you receive. And so, but all of these things, beyond, some of these things listed here, factor into our health, and they're described as the social determinants of health. And so the WHO defines the social determinants of health as the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. And these circumstances are shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources at global, national, and local levels. This is just some of the social determinants of health, but it gives you a sense of all of the different things that are really behind drivers, of differences in terms of outcomes, health status, functional limitations, all these things that you see here. And I would really challenge us as a field and say that we don't really do a great job of thinking about what are the social determinants of hearing health. At least we traditionally haven't been thinking in terms of this, but that we know it matters. Estimates go up to all the way up to 80% in terms of thinking about the factors that are driving outcomes in terms of health. That again, not just genetics and the clinical care you receive, but that a lot of that variation in terms of health outcomes has much more to do with these types of things than again with who you are and the clinical care that you receive. So when it comes to hearing healthcare, where are we? Again, thinking about our older adults. We know hearing loss, age-related hearing loss is incredibly common. Around 2/3 of adults 7 years and older in the US have a clinically significant hearing loss, but that there are low rates of hearing care, and that we look at those individuals who have hearing loss, and only about 15 to 20% of older adults actually use hearing aids. So we look at nationally representative data and we say, what do we see in terms of by race ethnicity? So when we look at something like recent hearing screening, we see, generally something that's covered by insurance. We really don't see differences by race ethnicity. But when we start to look at things like hearing aid use, we do start to see differences. Only around 10% of minority older adults who have hearing loss use hearing aids. So NHANES is one area that we can look at. This is nationally representative, but there are some other cohorts where we can also see, what do we find? So Health ABC is another cohort, not nationally representative, but it is a community-based cohort that was designed from the beginning to be a biracial cohort, meaning that they have specifically recruited both white and Black individuals to help us be able to kind of determine, differences in care. Health ABC is certainly not focused on hearing care, but they do have some measures of it, so we can learn at least a little something for this particular cohort. And again, we see differences by race, ethnicity, as well as socioeconomic position. And we can look to yet one more cohort, the ERIC cohort, again, not nationally representative, but a community-based sample. Again, a biracial cohort that was specifically recruited to have both white and Black individuals. And again, we see differences in hearing aid use depicted in those red bars there. Here it's broken down by cognitive status, but again, we see big differences in terms of hearing aid use by race ethnicity. And so we start to see, a little bit in terms of the epidemiology of age-related hearing loss. There are some opportunities to understand rates of hearing loss and hearing aid use, but that we really, don't have too much information when it comes to interventions. There are relatively few studies that include minority older adults. And to be a little bit more, systematic about it or objective about it, we've been in the process of conducting a systematic review of the past 30 years of hearing related studies, trials in the United States to look at and understand where is the minority representation. So I'll share with you just some of the preliminary results that we have so far. So over the past 30 years of the different hearing related studies that have been done in the US, less than 13% of those studies even report race ethnicity. And if we look at those who actually report race ethnicity, only 5 of them include a greater than 30% minority representation, which would roughly reflect minority representation currently in the United States. And it's expected to change over time. So we're really by far not getting the information we need in our studies. And so we think about, okay, where are we at in what we know? So yes, the literature is limited, but we do have some sense that yes, disparities do exist. And so then we need to be thinking about what are the mechanisms at play here? And so the mechanisms we often think about are some of the things that we measure, like, oh, we say, oh, differences exist by race, ethnicity, they exist by education, income, insurance status. And we're not really saying that those are, oftentimes if we're thinking, are those the drivers of these differences? No, we're really using them as kind of proxies for these other things that we're not necessarily measuring and that we haven't really measured. And I will say it's not just us within, hearing healthcare struggling to measure these things, but really across the board, trying to understand, how do we measure some of these other drivers? How do we measure the social determinants of health, the effects of racism, the effects of discrimination that we're not necessarily capturing, that we're kind of just using these proxies as indicators that are not really diving deep enough to understand how can we, interrupt these processes at play. And so I'll briefly talk about, well, why does this matter? Again, thinking about our older adults, for these past number of years now, we really can't be thinking about hearing loss or age-related hearing loss in isolation. We need to be thinking about hearing loss in the context of healthy aging. And so when we talk about hearing care, we're talking about hearing care as a potentially essential tool for aging well. And how do we need to ensure that all of our older adults have access to the care that they need so that they can hopefully reach that optimal health and optimal well-being as much as possible in terms of where hearing care fits into that greater process. And so if we're going to answer our question, well, how do we care for our older adults? I think for many of our older adults who do get care, we do a pretty good job. But the real question is, how do we care for all of our older adults? And that's not what we're doing. And we don't have even enough literature or evidence to understand where are we in that process. So what can we do? By no means is this meant to be an exhaustive list, but it's really just to kind of get us thinking and just to put a few things that I think many of us have already been thinking about. As researchers, we need to be reporting race ethnicity, even if it is an entirely white cohort, to list that and specifically say that. We need to consider who is not represented, both within our studies, and I think obviously much more broadly too, who is not being represented, who is not at the table with us. We need dedicated recruitment efforts that target individuals that may or may not have been in our studies before. There's a large body of literature out there of how we go about doing this that we can draw upon. And we need to include more robust measures when possible, where able, around social disadvantage, especially when we're thinking about some of these health behaviors. And the good news, I think, of all of that is that there are entire disciplines devoted to many of these types of things that are ready and willing to collaborate and really to help us expand in kind of new and different directions. And I say clinicians here, but really all of us in terms of understanding the biases inherent in our training and our practice, recognize our own biases, work to counteract them, consider the social determinants of our health, of health in practice. So not just something that we're looking, in an epidemiologic study, but in an everyday practice, and work to expand representation in our fields. And I recognize that there's a lot there that needs to be discussed and unpacked, but at least is a start. And there's a lot of work to be done. And I think at least we're starting to have conversations about these issues, but I think more importantly, committing to action so that we have, at least a shot at making progress. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
We don't have any questions in the queue, Eric.
All right, maybe in the interest of time, oh wait, no, we do have one.
So recommendation. Okay, yeah, sorry, do you want me?
No, go ahead. No, you got it. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks. So the questions are recommendations for more robust measures of social disadvantage. So it's tricky. I think it depends a lot on thinking about, the health behavior. So in certain studies, they look at things like, instead of just socioeconomic status at that point in time, sometimes you can look at things like cumulative socioeconomic status in terms of looking over the life course, particularly relevant if we're thinking about age-related hearing loss. So that, can be, one way of looking at it and thinking about it. Depending on, where your cohorts are, one of the big kind of hot topics, in the kind of dementia area are the large differences in terms of rates of dementia dementia by race, ethnicity, and trying to understand what's going on there. And so, for example, from that area, that field of looking at and thinking about measures of, racism or discrimination that individuals, may have faced over their life course. They also look at things, not just education, but where did you receive that education? Particularly if we're thinking about older adults, it may mean something very different for a Black older adult who, is maybe living in Chicago now, but they received their education in the South as a young adult. That education means something very different. So those are some of the types of kind of next level, going one step a little bit deeper, to try to get and understand what are the real drivers here. And again, not necessarily perfect. There's certainly limitations to these, but these are just a couple kind of examples to get us thinking.
Eric, there are a couple more questions. I'll let you decide if we should do now or wait.
I want to make sure that we get through all our talks. So let's hopefully there'll be time for more discussion at the end. All right. Thanks again. That was excellent talk. I really enjoyed that. Definitely had implications for what we should be doing in our studies. So our next speaker is Matthew Bush, MD, PhD. He's an associate professor of otolaryngology, head and neck surgery at the University of Kentucky. He is also the founder of the Kenya Outreach Program and is actively involved in clinical research on hearing healthcare disparities. His talk is entitled, Extending the Reach of Hearing Healthcare by Bridging the Gaps. Thanks, Matt, for being here, and take it away.
Well, thank you, Eric. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this esteemed panel and talk with you, my colleagues and friends. These are difficult times indeed. We're all trying to very carefully and pensively think about ways that we can improve our world in general. We certainly want to improve healthcare and hearing healthcare, but living in a better, safer world is certainly a priority for all of us. As Carrie had very carefully and correctly asserted, we certainly can't address all of the areas of racism systemically and societally. Beginning to ask good questions, beginning to listen is very important. And I'm hopeful that what this seminar will do will help begin to start more dialogue and help to stimulate deeper thought and more intentional directions in where we go. I'm going to talk to you today about extending the reach of hearing healthcare by bridging the gaps. I have some connections to some research funds, as well as some surgical advisory board membership to some different industry partners. None of this has conflicted or connected with any of the content that I'll discuss today. The research that I'll talk about is some research of my own, as well as research of others and unrelated to those affiliations. I grew up in West Virginia. I'm an Appalachian by birth. I grew up in Charleston, West Virginia, which is an urban area within a relatively rural state, a wild and wonderful West Virginia. And every West Virginian is very familiar with Bridge Day. Bridge Day is a day in October where some adventure seekers often go to this specific location, which is the New River Gorge Bridge. And the New River is an amazing river, beautiful scenery around Fayetteville, West Virginia. And some of these risk takers will jump with parachute, of course, off of the New River Gorge Bridge to hopefully land safely below without drowning or without impaling themselves on trees or limbs down below. But it's a real cultural event. It's certainly something I've never done, nor will I ever do. But this is a beautiful scene in a very rural area. And it's interesting that the New River is actually not new at all. It's one of the oldest rivers archaeologically and geographically, geologically. It's one of the oldest rivers in the world. So it was certainly new in the prospectors' mapping of this region of Western Virginia, but it's a very old river. I like this picture, and I like to use this type of imagery to think about, just perhaps to get us a frame of context for how we might understand some of these disparities and inequities in healthcare, and begin to think about these new gaps. We might be made more recently aware of them, but certainly none of these gaps in disparities are anything new. I will ask you some questions and ask some questions of myself. I'll try to answer some of these things in a similar way that Carrie had presented some things, again, to stimulate discussion and to stimulate some thought. I think an important question is, what are the disparities in hearing healthcare? We might see a variety of different disparities depending on our perspective. Perhaps for a clinician scientist or a scientist thinking about novel research developments and innovations, and then how do we translate what we find in the lab or what we find within clinical research programs or clinical trials into actual clinical practice, and how do we translate that? And many times there's a disparity and delay and difficulties in translating promising research into practice. I think this is another really important disparity to consider as well, about the diversity of hearing specialists. How do we take training and expertise in hearing healthcare and then connect that with a more equitable or more even represented hearing healthcare force moving forward? And there's certainly a gap between underrepresented groups and who we're able to train as the next generation of hearing specialists. Lastly, we can also consider the topic at hand of health and healthcare. How do we take evidence-based care and how do we connect that to the populations who are in need of that care? I think we need to think beyond about more than just the evidence-based care. I think we need to think about equitable health and healthcare. And to me, I define this a little bit more an expanded way of not just giving evidence-based care, ensuring that someone can get care, but we want to ensure in the future that we can have full access to and utilization of evidence-based care with equitable outcomes. How can we get outcomes that are similar to populations that are in need of that care? Again, in defining our gaps, we need to go back to definitions and really understand the complexities that are related to that. And health and healthcare disparities refer to those differences in health and healthcare between population groups. And that can occur across many dimensions, which include race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, age, location, gender, disability status, and sexual orientation. As we might define that in hearing healthcare, we look at the incidence of hearing loss, which continues to rise. And this is, based on the WHO data, 466 million people across the world with hearing loss. And there is a sustained global burden of disease that we as a healthcare field don't seem to be making a dramatic impact in. There's also gaps in the timing of diagnosis. There continues to be lack of incentive and motivation to implement screening for hearing loss in primary care settings. There's also pervasive delays in adult and pediatric diagnosis of hearing loss. We also can see treatment utilization differences, the limited use of hearing aids, and poor penetration of cochlear implantation throughout a wider population and diverse population. There's challenges in access to experts, lack of access to audiologists, ENTs, cochlear implant centers, speech therapists, all of the many people that make up multidisciplinary teams and all the different specialists and all the people that are involved in providing comprehensive hearing healthcare is not equitably dispersed to all people. Additionally, differences in outcomes. There are dramatic differences in outcomes between patients that we might consider quote unquote similar. Beginning to understand the differences of our patients, not only who they are, but also maybe what's going on with the care that they receive that might influence outcomes. So what's at play? What are the causative factors behind health and healthcare disparities? And we might give an answer to that question by saying that complex and interrelated set of individual, provider, health system, societal, and environmental factors all contribute together simultaneously in a very complex way to disparities in health and healthcare. And as Carrie had mentioned, this is a gold standard slide for health disparity researchers, these social determinants of health that we have to constantly go back to and consider what are these factors that may influence some of these gaps. Certainly there are economic, there are physical location factors, but also educational, nutritional, community and social context, as well as overall health systems and healthcare systems that all influence care. This is difficult for us to fully conceptualize and understand. Within hearing healthcare, we tend to focus on a very, very specific subset of patients and a very specific disease entity, and sometimes in research, a very specific cell within the cochlea. So we're sort of trained and reinforced to be able to be thinking more and more microscopically. But issues like this need to make us think macroscopically and expand what we understand. If we're to adapt theory, and this is a very helpful article that came out of the Journal of American College of Surgeons that began to apply theory to practice and taking social determinants of health. And if we put it perhaps in a more practical way, how can we consider these theories and what it means? What are the patient factors? Who is this patient? Where do they live? What's going on in their life? Who has been caring for them in their home? And then there's provider factors. Who are the team members of the hearing healthcare around them to care for them? There's system and access issues. There's clinical care and quality issues that influence disparities. And then there may be also this post-operative care, a patient that may undergo a surgical procedure or have some type of intervention provided, a hearing aid fitting or speech therapy. What are the post-treatment care and rehabilitation barriers and challenges? And all these things influence hearing health disparities. And it's interesting too that racism affects each and every aspect of these things and how people are treated differently. So if we describe these gaps, we might look at these factors, patient, provider factors, system and access issues, clinical care and quality, and post-op care and rehab as sort of this very rocky bottom of the New River Gorge, potentially dangerous place and somewhat, very distant, very far off, very difficult to be able to address and comprehensively repair and fix these problems. So if we were to describe those gaps, perhaps in a more practical sense, who has hearing loss? How do we study this? Who are the people that are more likely to get hearing loss? And we find sometimes that there's higher incidence of hearing loss in those with lower education, lower income, unemployment. Why is that? Who receives care for hearing loss? Access and utilization can be influenced by socioeconomic status, race, geography. Just based on the town where you live or the town where you're born may influence you from ever seeing a hearing healthcare specialist. Where are those providers located? There's a global shortage of hearing healthcare specialists, and there's limited diversity and a distribution of a diverse workforce within hearing healthcare. Lastly, we could also consider who has the best outcomes. There's evidence that racial and ethnic minorities may be more likely treated in a lower volume center, perhaps a center that may have less experience with a complex problem, maybe related to skull-base surgery or perhaps related to sensorineural hearing loss. But that where those patients are seen is potential influencing factor on the outcomes. So why do these matter? I'll ask the same question that Carrie asked as well. And my answer to this is a little bit broader in a sense of that, for one, this affects real individuals. I mean, real individuals are suffering and having difficulty today. And I think we need to personalize disparities and realizing that this is why we do this, because there's real people that are suffering. This is a big reason of why I'm in hearing health disparity work, is because I grew up in this region of the country in rural Appalachia, and seeing people have difficulty in access to care affects me personally. So we can't forget the personal aspect of this. There's also an issue of populations, that there is a limit to overall population health and where our society can move in general in overall health by the population health that's influenced. Another factor why this is important is the price, is that this increases the cost for everybody. Price is going up for healthcare, and caring for those with the poor outcomes and the poor social determinants of health influences the price for everybody. This is also important because this influences policy, this is the influencing effect of regulation, legislation, basically the future of healthcare as we move forward. And you can see some of the figures that I've listed here. I mean, there's billions of dollars that are spent every year because of health disparities in general, as well as economic losses that are even very difficult to conceptualize and to quantify. So what can we do about disparities in hearing healthcare? Well, the answer to that is that it's complicated. It's not something that we can solve over a lunchtime seminar. It's something that we begin to converse. We continue to stay on topic. We begin to continue to work through these things. Also drawing from some literature that comes from a broader American College of Surgeons, I think, which is helpful for subspecialties such as hearing healthcare. It's important for us to bridge gaps, and we need to be able to set forth agendas in disparity work and disparity program planning, as well as disparity research, for how can we address this. And I'm hopeful that perhaps these 5 points, that these agenda items that were set forth in this particular article within the Journal of American College of Surgeons would be helpful and informative. First part is to improve patient-clinician communication, developing culturally dexterous communication, an ability to communicate across socioeconomic status, educational differences, geographic differences, racial and ethnic barriers, learning to bring in a diverse clinician set and healthcare team that is able to very adeptly and comfortably address natural barriers in communications. This affects patients' choices. We are never able to know the challenges of the patients that don't see us in the clinic or don't see us in the audio booth. And so we need to figure out ways that we improve communication. Secondly, we also need to improve our outreach, set our focus on how do we expand community engagement and outreach through technology. Education, literacy, shared decision-making are all methods to address this, but this is a really broad topic, but deserves our attention as a specialty. Next, we need to improve care at centers where there's a higher percentage of minority care. We need to outfit those research labs. We need to impact positively and with finances these centers that are providing care for a diverse patient population to try to expand the quality of care that's provided. Next, we could evaluate long-term effective interventions on functional outcomes and patient-defined quality of life measures. This is really important, to not define success by what our perception is objectively on an audiogram or in some other objective measure, but begin to determine what matters to the patients, what matters to the communities that are around these patients, and then design interventions, design therapies that address those. Lastly, we can improve patient-centeredness by evaluating patient expectations. So always being patient-centered, always connecting back with patients that had a good outcome and why they had a good outcome. Also, and even more importantly, learning from those that did not have a good outcome. And what can we learn from the process of the care that they went through? This is an important aspect. And as we set the agenda for disparity research, that's something that hearing healthcare could really address moving forward. So again, to use the same imagery, how do we bridge hearing healthcare gaps, and how do we provide that full access to and utilization of evidence-based care with equitable outcomes. We can begin to bridge that gap by thinking about these real milestones and key agenda items of developing better communication, expanding the way that we outreach outside of our universities, outside of our clinics, outside of our labs, to think broadly, to reach those unreached communities, resource centers with minority care. We can focus on long-term patient-defined quality of life, and then align our expectations and goals with that of the patient. That's really critical to be able to bridge those gaps. Thank you for your time. I appreciate your attendance today.
There are many questions. Eric, could we use one question for?
Yeah, definitely.
So one that may be particularly pertinent to you, Dr. Bush, is what is NIH or other funders for that matter doing to ensure that there is a representative sample in studies they fund? And I ask you this because I know you've gone the extra mile to specifically secure funding to study underrepresented populations.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the NIH is doing what they can with resources that they have. The goal is to try to increase the rigor and reproducibility of research. And so that's certainly an important part of applications, especially any clinical trial or clinically focused research needs to be able to understand the breadth, whether it be of our reporting. And I think as Carrie had wisely mentioned as well, that this is critical for us to all agree that race matters in how we are reporting and how we're researching, that certain outcomes that we may report in an all-white cochlear implant outcome study does not apply to everyone. And so as journal reviewers, as researchers, as professional members of this community, we need to embrace what we think is important, and that is diversity moving forward. And I think the NIH is requiring that. The NIH is also doing what they can to try to expand the development of new clinician scientists. And we need to be a part of that, of helping to identify, and just as someone helped us, and we stand on the shoulders of giants as we move forward in our careers, of really putting our time and resources. There's value to that. There may not be DOE effort that's devoted to it, but this is why this matters. Because again, it's individuals that are either being looked over or being given opportunities by those of us who have been given opportunities. So I think it's a personal issue that we really take advantage of, but I think we promote those people and encourage them in these career development tracks and research funding opportunities through the NIDCD. To address that. Dr. Tucci sent a very, very nice email this week that addressed some of the perspectives and some of the goals to move things forward with training and the resources that they're going to do to expand diversity and address issues of racism.
Thank you. There are other questions we'll hold. I'd just like to point out there is a note from Bruce Edwards in the chat window with a nice link to a clear and formal definition of social disadvantage if you're interested in going there.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was an excellent talk. I definitely appreciated a lot of what you had to say. And as Sumit mentioned in the chat, this recording will be made available. So we're all going to be able to go back and look at this stuff again. I really appreciated your comments on the role of patient-centered care in addressing disparities. I think that's true for research as well. I think by taking into account the experience of our participants and taking seriously what they say, rather than just saying, well, they don't really understand, I think is helpful. All right, I think we're pretty much still on track. Our last talk will be by Nicole Marrone. Nicole is the James S. and Dean Pignatelli Unisource Clinical Chair in Audiological Rehabilitation for Adults at the University of Arizona, and is an Associate Professor of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences. Her research investigates hearing loss and rehabilitation in adults. Her specialty is how interventions, including hearing aids and group audiologic rehabilitation, can people's quality of life and communication in everyday environments. Part of Dr. Marrone's research focuses on increasing access to hearing healthcare in rural communities. And the title of her talk is Community-Based Participatory Research to Advance Equity and Inclusion. Thanks, Nicole, for being here today. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. And I have a co-author with me on my talk, Dr. Eileen Wong, also a professor at the University of Arizona. And we'd like to begin by giving a land acknowledgement that the University of Arizona sits on the original homelands of Indigenous peoples. And we acknowledge the privilege it is to teach and conduct research in this region, and we express our gratitude to the tribal nation. And I would also like to dedicate my presentation today to the memory of those we have lost to systemic inequities and injustices. We are 54 years later in history than when Dr. Martin Luther King spoke these words. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhuman because it often results in physical death. I see no alternative to direct action and creative nonviolence to raise the conscience of the nation. And today our nation remains painfully unjust, leading to us gathering today, and thank you all for gathering today. And despite being recognized and documented for years, disparities in health and healthcare access have persisted. And so we acknowledge and remember that human lives end because of racialized injustice. I'm humbled and honored to speak today and acknowledge my privilege in doing so as a white woman from Minnesota. I bore witness to the protests this summer, and I'm here to do anti-racist work. It is an uncomfortable fact about doing research in the area of health and healthcare disparities. That means that the data comes on the backs of people who are living through shocking and inhuman systemic injustices. And like Dr. Bush was just saying, it's personal. These are people experiencing this and living it. And I believe that I have a responsibility as a researcher to recognize the intersecting oppressions and privileges that underlie racialized inequities. I'm also honored to work with a team of dedicated people on this work. This includes my colleague, Dr. Eileen Wong, who co-authored today's presentation with me, and a team of interdisciplinary scholars across public health, Spanish, the community health center that we work with, audiology, and a number of trainees that we've had over the years who've been supported by diversity supplements to our NIH-funded grant and from other research initiatives that have been funded through our university to increase diverse perspectives in research. And so I'm very honored to work with these wonderful people. Our research was supported by funding from the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders. And we currently have funding from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute that I'll speak to you about a little at the end. Today, we're going to very quickly touch on these because you've heard before about the hearing healthcare disparities in the US. Identify the necessity to serve patients in a way that is culturally responsive with patient-centeredness, like Dr. Bush talked about. We're gonna name strategies and approaches to transform research practices, and then I'm gonna end with a call to action to take steps to address the need for increased diversity in our profession. And these are the themes for us today. Our work is really focused on advancing equity in clinical research and clinical education, ultimately to lead better outcomes, we hope, in our communities and maybe someday at a population level as well. We want to see transformational change to serve people better, shaping clinical interactions like Dr. Bush just mentioned, transforming our research practices, and increasing professional leadership and diversity. And why this is important, of course, is because we all know we're all gathered here, we study in this area because hearing healthcare is important to health and well-being, with multiple impacts on communication access, participation, health, and quality of life. And our other speakers have really nicely shared with you that the social determinants of health mean that our hearing health doesn't happen in a vacuum. We're not isolated from the impacts, broader impacts. Dr. Nieman showed you disparities at a national level. These are data shown in a slightly different way because I'm going to come back to it in a few minutes. Looking at Healthy People 2020 targets. Healthy People 2020 are the public health goals for our nation, and they're specifically striving to improve the health of all people in the US. And so there's disparity if an outcome is seen to a greater or lesser extent between populations. And like Dr. Nieman spoke about in this data set as well, the data show us that there are fewer Hispanic or Latino and fewer Black or African Americans who are using hearing aids as compared to white Americans. So while the overall level looks like we're meeting the healthy people target, if you look more closely, we're really not doing that equitably. And we have rural disparities as well in Arizona. We've been looking at that in some detail and asked a question geographically, where are the audiologists relative to the population who may need care? And you see here's a map of our state, and you see the heat map is for the population of where people with hearing loss are in our state, the highest numbers of them, but all counties, of course, have people with hearing loss. These clusters, of course, are Phoenix and Tucson, and the outlying areas of our state have very few audiologists. So people may travel up to 100 miles to see an audiologist, and there's 6 non-metro counties in Arizona without any audiologists at all, including the county where we focus our research, a border community in Arizona in Santa Cruz County. Just briefly to touch on the theme that Dr. Bush had mentioned as well on patient-centeredness, we think about patient-centered care as really including culture. So taking a culturally responsive approach to patient-centered care. Dr. Wong and I reflected on this, and this slide comes from some preparations that she made, where we want to acknowledge that we can't ignore culture. We can't act like we know everything about our patients' culture, and so we need to partner with our patients, and that's the first element of culturally responsive patient-centered care. We have an image of a gem to represent the value and the wisdom of lived experience. Growth mindset is really on the clinician themselves to really be challenging yourself always. Being culturally competent is not checking a box on a checklist and saying, I know something about this culture, right? It's having cultural humility and knowing and trying always to shape our practices for the better. Theory of mind is really considering from this personalized perspective, what is it like to be living in these social determinants of health? And it's essential for the clinician or researcher to recognize that our perspective, we may have a way of thinking that improving access will work, and that's not necessarily relevant to the lived experience in the community. And finally, collaboration, that there's many stakeholders of our patients. And so we don't just collaborate to divvy up the work, but really to learn from each other. And so these are several themes. And one theme I just want to touch back on is that in our research is really looking at, these are communities living with health disparities, but the communities also have cultural wealth themselves, and what can we learn from that, and not viewing disparities work as a totally deficit-based perspective, but really finding the strengths in the communities we're working with through humility and increasing diversity. So some strategies that we've used in transforming our research practices, we've been asking the question, how can research on health disparities be conducted in a way that gives justice to the wisdom and strengths of communities and leads to action? The approach that we've been using for the last several years is community-based participatory research. And that's a methodology drawing from expertise by our colleagues in public health on community-based participatory research. And it involves community members as equitable partners on the research team. So again, this is really different from partnering with a community partner to just recruit better into your study, or to just advertise about something. It's really shifting the power differential and the power dynamics that happen in research partnerships. And so instead of a vertical organization of hierarchy where I'm the PI and I say this is what goes for my study, right? It's very different. It's a horizontal leadership style, and really bringing people to table to have influence on decisions about research that's happening in their own communities. To do that work, our participatory process, we partnered with community health workers who are members of the community, often called frontline public health workers. They tend to help the community in so many different ways, but among them, and what connected me to this idea of working with community health workers, is in their assisting the community in understanding and accessing the health system, and in providing peer support. And so in our study, our studies, community health workers were the facilitators ultimately, but also important members of our research team. In our study, we did a randomized control trial ultimately following after years of work in the community leading up to that randomized control trial. And I'm just going to share briefly a bit of the results with you today. It was the Oyendo Bien clinical trial, which was conducted in partnership following the community-based participatory research methods. This was a 5-week program that was co-designed with the Promotores de Salud, the community health workers at the partnering health center. And we held the sessions in community meeting spaces. And so we disrupted the idea of having patients come to us in the clinic and brought audiologists out into the community to interact with community members directly. And we had a 2-arm randomized controlled trial that had an immediate intervention group and a waitlist group. We compared the primary RCT outcomes there, and then we had the waitlist group receive the intervention, and that was a decision informed by the community partners that it would not be equitable to have people wait a very long time to receive the intervention. And so after identifying hearing loss in them. And so ultimately we grouped them all together and followed outcomes for everyone over a year. And our main finding for our primary outcome was that we did see an increased use in communication strategies, significantly greater use of strategies in the immediate intervention compared to the waitlist group. And excitingly, those strategies, people still use those strategies over 1 year later. And we plotted some of our data comparing back to the Healthy People objective. So the bars I've shown here are for white Americans and Hispanic Americans, harkening back to that figure we looked at already. And you see at baseline in our Oyendo Bien clinical trial, we saw the disparity of not as many people having hearing aids. And excitingly, after a year without giving hearing aids as part of the intervention, but this community level intervention, people went on to get hearing aids and reported that back to us 1 year later. So closing some of those gaps, trying to bridge the gaps through work with community health workers. So the Oyendo Bien intervention did increase hearing health actions taken over time. The community health workers we worked with were a feasible link. And overall, our results are positively contributing to efforts to increase access to care and advance health equity. And what we would like to see now is to extend this work and scale it up from this single health center that we've worked with to other centers. And so for today, with this audience, I want to end with a call to action to you all, as we all have really, to say we hear the call to do work in this area. We are here to do anti-racist work. I want to invite you to do the work and do the work with me and reach out to me and connect about this. One of the ways you can connect about it is that with colleagues David Lee at the University of Miami, we have a coalition that we have formed through funding with the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and PCORI really encourages us to do research differently. And you're all invited, you can join as partners of our coalition. And so you can find information about that either on Facebook or our website or sending an email. And I would encourage you all to expand your teams and get out into the community and really start connecting with people. I didn't speak any Spanish when I first moved to Arizona, and I am learning Spanish. And just don't see those kinds of things as barriers. Work with people on your team, get the expertise you need. And also, really, I just wanted to call attention to some data that were recently published by the American Speech Language Hearing Association about the race and ethnicity distribution of audiologists. And you see this tiny bar here that 97% of ASHA audiologists are not Hispanic or Latino, and 3% are Hispanic or Latino. I think we all need to work very diligently in this area and just know that active recruiting is not enough. We need to do holistic admissions. Once a student is in your program, we need equitable mentoring. We need to be connecting students and advising them equitably. We need to be using inclusive teaching practices, anti-racist pedagogy, and really reporting race and ethnicity data like Dr. Nieman mentioned. So I just close by asking you, what will you do? And an encouraging word from Angela Davis: you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Eric.
Wonderful, Nicole, really inspiring. I think, I don't know if we have time to go past 11 for more discussion, but I really want Heather to get a chance to say a little bit about AAS before we end.
That sounds good. I'm posting the email addresses for the authors or for the speakers today. They have agreed, except I couldn't get a hold of Nicole to answer questions offline as well. But please hang out for a few seconds for Heather, our chair of the membership committee, to say a few words.
I just want to say thank you to our speakers for such a wonderful seminar. I mean, I believe and I hope we are finally at a tipping point in healthcare and politics, maybe in our society, where we're not only identifying our disparities, but we actually are not going to tolerate them anymore, and we're going to do something about it. So Dr. Marrone, I think that was a fantastic way to end. Thank you guys again, and to our audience, we sincerely thank you for taking time out of your workday to join us. My hope there is that our speakers enlighten you as well as motivated you to use this knowledge in your own practice, or to basically, I don't know, rise up and to continue the research and the work that we do. And regarding the AAS is a very unique organization that blends stakeholders in auditory health. I think it's a great organization because it blends industry to clinicians to researchers. And for those that are not a member, I really encourage you to become one. And the benefits of it include not only wonderful seminars like we had today, but also our members received discounted registration rates for our annual conference that's held in the spring, and that is a fantastic meeting. They also get an online subscription to the Ear and Hearing Journal, which obviously is a top-tier journal for our field. And it's also a chance to collaborate and meet researchers and audiologists and clinicians from around the world. So please do that. I believe that, you know, we've got our website up here, and that can help you can explore that to find out how to become a member. And finally, and it's almost like Dr. Marrone, you said what we wanted to do for AAS. You know, we want to highlight an initiative by the AAS, which is to it's a beautiful capstone, I think, to the seminar. So the idea is a pledge and a fund that was born out of the murder of George Floyd, and also the continued systemic inequities that we've seen. It was established by our current and past presidents, and the fund's goal is to create an endowment that supplements current activities, such as like a seminar like this. But we also want to support new endeavors that fulfill those values of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access that are what we're trying to make fundamental to the AAS. And to learn more about the Idea Fund, as well as how you can donate, please check out the following website, and you'll see a link on the website for that as well. And then another thing that's wonderful about AAS is, even though we're the leaders of it, this is your organization. And so we seek input and would love to hear your ideas how we should use this Idea Funds. And so please send your thoughts to, and I'm going to I will copy this so that I can put it in the chat box for everybody. Please send your thoughts to this email address, or any one of us to share. So thank you again. Made my day, made my Friday, so.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. We were at 153 at our peak. So this is quite the show, and thanks to our speakers for taking the time to participate. See you all later.
Thanks for coming. It was great to see those of you that I haven't seen in a long time.